Hail and welcome. Paul here, and this is my first pre-recorded lecture for my online course on Dark Age Britain. Now, my original plan was to record the live sessions using the Vidyard app, but we had so much technical difficulties figuring that app out that we figured it would be easier to do a pre-recorded lecture for YouTube separate from the live session. And since we couldn't include the discussion that we had in the live session in this video, I decided that we would consider the questions asked during the discussion and bring those up at the end. So, and if you have any questions after watching this, just feel free to message me and I'll be happy to answer. So without further ado, let's begin. This is the first lecture on Dark Age Britain, the 5th century, which is when the Anglo-Saxon period began. This is often referred to by Anglo-Saxon historians as being the invasion period. Now, to understand this period, we need to briefly review Britain before the Anglo-Saxons came and the events that led up to it. So, since the 1st century AD, Britain was a Roman stronghold. The Romans came over and subjugated the native Celtic tribe, the Britons, who I will talk more about shortly. They built roads, villas, and palaces, and in the 4th century, the Emperor Constantine spread Roman Christianity on the island. Most importantly, Britain was militarily dependent on the Roman garrison. Many of the Celtic tribes had been trained in Roman warfare, and even self-identified as Romans. But the true Romans were pretty much the muscle of the island of Britain. However, in the early 5th century, around the year 410, something happened. The Roman Empire began to fall. Italy and Gaul were under attack by barbarian tribes coming from the east. These tribes were the Goths, the Vandals, and the Huns. Needing all the help that they can get, the emperor called for the Roman garrison of Britain to withdraw to protect the heart of the empire. This meant that the Romans were leaving the native Britons to pretty much fend for themselves. This was not good news for them. The Britons had been considerably weakened by centuries of dependency on the Romans. The Roman departure from Britain just made the native tribes extremely vulnerable, and they were facing numerous attacks from other barbarian tribes, the Picts and the Irish. There is a famous letter sent to the Roman emperor for military aid with no avail, which is recalled in the following century by a monk named Gildas, in an account called The Groans of the Britons. The most famous part: "The barbarians drive us to the sea. The sea drives us to the barbarians. Between these two means of death, we are either killed or drowned." Well, long story short, the emperor never sent help, and the barbarians kept driving the Britons to the sea, and the sea kept pushing them back to the barbarians. These attacks went on for decades. The Britons needed to figure out a solution to this problem fast, and the solution came to them from a king who Gildas refers to as Proud Tyrant. Later accounts from the 8th century historian, the Venerable Bede, give us what his name might have actually been: Vortigern. Now, Vortigern proposed a very Roman idea: to hire barbarians to fight barbarians. And at the time, you had tribes from what is now Germany, the Netherlands, and southern Denmark: the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, and to an extent the Frisians. These tribes were a problem to the Roman Empire, being raiders and pirates. However, Vortigern had the ambitious idea to make them part of the solution. He decided he would hire them as mercenaries to fight the Irish and the Picts. What could go wrong? Well, a lot could go wrong. So around the year 449, two brothers named Hengist and Horsa sailed to Britain to mercenary for Vortigern and fight the Irish and the Picts. In return, Vortigern offered the brothers land in the southeast of Britain in the Kingdom of Kent. He also offered the hand in marriage to Hengist's daughter Rowena. Over the years, however, Vortigern began to fail to produce enough food for his own people, let alone the increasing number of Anglo-Saxons in the southeast. According to many, this is where the conflict between the Britons and the Anglo-Saxons truly started to take off. A conflict that would last for centuries. In later centuries, this conflict is signified in an Arthurian legend about two dragons. What happened in the legend was this. Vortigern was being consulted by a wise wizard, who in the 9th century account by Ninnius shared the name of a real Roman officer named Ambrosius Aurelianus, who I will talk more about later. In the later 12th century account by Geoffrey of Monmouth, he was given the name that we all know, Merlin. So the wizard had a vision of a red dragon and a white dragon fighting each other, and the red dragon symbolized the native Britons, and the white dragon symbolized the invading Anglo-Saxons. And the white dragon would take over the land of the red dragon, but supposedly the red dragon will rise again. And so it would come to pass in the coming decades after Hengist and Horsa. More and more Angles and Saxons would sail over from Germany. Now, there are a lot of theories as to why they left Germany. Many will say they left because of famine, disease, and flooding. Plus, with the absence of the Romans, a power vacuum was created, making Britain a land very vulnerable to invasion. So the Anglo-Saxons, slowly but surely, began to take over the island. The next significant event during this invasion period happened in the year 477, when a warlord named Aiel arrived on British soil and created the kingdom of the South Saxons, or Sussex. According to Bede, Aiel was even considered the first overking of the Anglo-Saxons, or Bretwalda, a term that basically means Emperor of Saxon Britain. We will run into this word a lot throughout these lectures. Now, it is safe to say that Aiel of Sussex was pretty much the scourge of the native Britons, and his wrath against them came to a peak in the year 491 at the Roman fort in Pevensey, where the Saxons laid siege, and apparently not a single Briton was left alive. Also in the 490s, another Saxon named Cerdic landed in Britain with his son Cynric and 5 ships of warriors. After 24 years of battles and campaigns against the native Britons, Cerdic became the first king of the West Saxons in the kingdom of Wessex, a kingdom that would become extremely important in the coming centuries. So the 490s were an extremely tumultuous period in Dark Age Britain. The power of the Anglo-Saxons was growing rapidly. More and more Anglo-Saxons were coming over from Germany, laying siege to the native Britons and establishing kingdoms of their own. However, the Britons were also learning how to stand up for themselves, and a resistance movement was being created. This resistance movement is signified by a semi-legendary figure that I am sure everybody is familiar with, King Arthur. Now let's talk about Arthur. Most of the legends and fictional stories we have about King Arthur were written in the later Middle Ages, between the 12th and 15th centuries. Stories of the magic sword Excalibur and the Knights of the Round Table jousting and going on quests for the Holy Grail. Now, these stories were purely products of the time that they were written. It is said that if Arthur really did exist, he would have existed long before that, during this period. He would have been a military leader of the Romano-Britons who led his warriors against the invading Anglo-Saxons. There is one historical figure that Arthur is often associated with, Ambrosius Aurelianus, but the connection between these two figures is kind of sketchy and hard to figure out. As I said earlier in this lecture, many will say that Ambrosius was more so the inspiration behind Arthur's wizard Merlin, rather than Arthur himself. So who is Arthur? Well, there's nothing written during this period that talks about an Arthur. The first thing we see about him came 400 years later, during the 9th century, from a Welsh monk named Ninnius, who claims that sometime between the late 400s and early 500s, this Arthur won a decisive victory against the Saxons at the Battle of Mount Badon, or Badon Hill. Now, the monk Gildas too wrote about the Battle of Badon Hill, and he lived much closer to this period. However, his account doesn't mention anything about an Arthur, so it's honestly 50-50 whether Arthur was even real or not. And if he were real, he might not have even been a king, but just a formidable warlord. Whether he was real or not, the Battle of Mount Badon was. And after decades of Anglo-Saxon victories, the native Britons were finally victorious. Not victorious enough to completely eradicate the Anglo-Saxons, but following the battle, there was a period of relative peace and diplomacy, where the Anglo-Saxons stuck to their settled lands, and the Britons were allowed to prosper in the remaining land that they held for centuries. The Anglo-Saxons would slowly conquer more land throughout the 6th and 7th centuries, but all in all, after Badon Hill, there was a sense of native British land here in the west, and Anglo-Saxon land here in the east. And the native British land would go on to be known as Wales, and the Anglo-Saxon land would become known as England. Now, I will go over the questions asked during the live session. First, we were asked about the Picts and to elaborate more on them and who exactly they were. They were the blue-painted tribes of the north. They could have existed in Britain before the Britons even came up from Gaul, because the Britons had come up from Celtic Gaul and took over most of the southern portion of the island. After the Roman invasion of Britain, the Picts were such a problem to the Romans that they had to build a wall to keep them out. Hadrian's Wall. It's all across the north. It is said they are descended from a tribe called the Caledoni, an Iron Age tribe. We know nothing about their pagan beliefs or their mythology because they have nothing left over from that. The only thing we really have left over from them is these standing stones that you can still see in parts of Scotland. They were eventually converted to Christianity by an Irish saint named Saint Columba. And the first notable Christian Pict was named Saint Ninian. Eventually the Scots would come over from Northern Ireland and created the kingdom of Dal Riata. I'll talk more about that in my next 2 lectures. And eventually the Scots and Picts merged to pretty much become the Scottish. We were also asked about the sword Excalibur and to elaborate more on that. Now, the name Excalibur is French, and it's written of in the French Arthurian legends. Earlier Welsh sources have Arthur's sword named Caledfolk, which Geoffrey of Monmouth Latinizes as Caliburnus, and then later the French writers who wrote their own Arthurian stories turned Caliburnus into Excalibur. It is also important to note that many people will say Arthur pulled Excalibur from the stone. The truth is, the sword in the stone and Excalibur were 2 separate swords. The sword in the stone was just the sword in the stone. It wasn't Excalibur. And he pulled that sword from the stone to declare himself king. Excalibur was bestowed upon him by the Lady of the Lake. And you know that famous image of her raising her hand out of the water holding the sword. This was given to him long after he had become king, or shortly after he had become king. And it was because Merlin had decided that if Arthur was going to become king and had such a beautiful queen like Guinevere, people would covet him. So he needed a mighty sword for protection. So that's Excalibur. He had the sword in the stone, which declared himself king, and Excalibur, which would be his protective sword that he would receive as king. We also talked a little bit about Merlin and the origins of Merlin. Now I talked about his origins from Ambrosius Aurelianus and the story of Vortigern and the two dragons, there is another source that Merlin is based on, and this is also embellished by Geoffrey of Monmouth in a different story. Now, this story takes place 100 years later in the mid-6th century, and it takes place further north in Britain in the old northern kingdoms of the Hen Ogledd. And I'll talk more about the Hen Ogledd in my next lecture. And it's a Welsh bard named Myrddin, and that's where the name Merlin would have come from. It's Myrddin. So in this story, you have a war between the pagan kingdoms in the Old North and the Christian kingdom. You have the pagan kingdoms of Gwynedd and Cumbria versus the Christian kingdom of Strathclyde. And Merlin is on the pagan side, and that's the side that loses. So he goes into exile in the forest and becomes a mad shaman, if you will, being one with the animals, foraging, and also constantly living in fear of persecution. So this is supposedly based off of a real battle, the Battle of Arthurian. And Geoffrey of Monmouth also, like I said, he also embellishes this story. So he pretty much creates two different Merlin stories that take place like 100 years apart from each other in different parts of Britain. But what he does is he combines these two figures, Ambrosius and Myrddin, and creates a very powerful wizard figure, Merlin. We were also asked, when I was talking about the two dragons, if the red dragon is the same dragon that is on the Welsh flag. And yes, it is. That is the same dragon, that symbolizes the same dragon as mentioned in Geoffrey's story. And the white dragon also was a heraldry of the Anglo-Saxons. I also actually have it on my shirt right there, the Wyvern of Wessex. So from this story from Geoffrey of Monmouth, the red dragon became a symbol of the Welsh, and the white dragon became a symbol of the English. So yeah, that's about it. Also, if you want to get into a great fictional series about this time period, I highly recommend Bernard Cornwell's Warlord trilogy. From the Welsh point of view, it's an Arthurian story. So the Anglo-Saxons are the bad guys in it. However, there are some really interesting Saxon characters. They make a really cool noble villain, anti-hero type character out of Isle of Sussex. You also have some characters out of some real Romano-British historical figures. It's also got all the characters you'd expect from a classic Arthurian tale: Lancelot, Guinevere, Merlin, Mordred. It's the same author that does the Last Kingdom series, the Saxon Tales, which is set in the 9th and 10th centuries. These are phenomenal books, also available on Audible. There's 3 of them: The Winter King, Enemy of God, and Excalibur. So yeah, get on those. So I will see you all next time. In the next lecture, we will be talking about the 6th century and the rise of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the Heptarchy, as it would come to be called, as well as the remaining Celtic kingdoms. We'll also be talking about how the Anglo-Saxons would eventually become Christian, and we'll be talking about the story of Beowulf. So I will see you all next time.